Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Vanook, the Executive Director of Library Reads. Thank you so much for joining us for the 9th installment of the Mystery at the Library Book Club series, brought to you by Sourcebooks and Baker & Taylor. Tonight, we're also streaming the event on Facebook Live, so welcome to all of you attending through Facebook. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with author Marie Benedict, who will be discussing her instant New York Times and USA Today bestseller, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. Before we begin the discussion, I have a few housekeeping items to make everyone aware of. There will be chances to win prizes throughout this event. All you have to do is participate in the trivia poll that happens right around the midway mark of the event, or ask a question for Marie, and you'll be entered to win a mystery book bundle from Sourcebooks. Now, don't worry, you'll know exactly when the trivia is happening. And if you are participating via Facebook, go ahead and enter any questions that you have in the comments. And one of our wonderful Sourcebooks folks that's moderating over there will bring those over to Zoom for us, so no problem, we will see those. Those of you on Zoom with us tonight, if you have questions for Marie, please put those in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen. Now, there's also the chat box at the side that I already see people saying hello, which is awesome. Go ahead and use that to chat with each other, to say hi, to just kind of, introduce yourselves. We're happy that you're here. But if you have a specific question that you'd like us to try and get to at the end of the evening, please help us out by putting it in that Q&A box. That way we don't have to quite watch the dozens of things going through at once. If they're in the Q&A box, a little bit easier for us to find. So please do that. Again, if you're on Facebook, just put those in the comments and we'll get those at Zoom. So let's get started with a little background on Marie. Marie Benedict is a lawyer with more than 10 years experience as a litigator at 2 of the country's premier law firms and for Fortune 500 companies. She is a magna cum laude graduate of Boston College with a focus in history and art history, and a cum laude graduate of the Boston University School of Law. Marie, the author of The Other Einstein, Carnegie's Maid, The Only Woman in the Room, Lady Clementine, and The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, views herself as an archaeologist of sorts, telling the untold stories of women. She lives in Pittsburgh with her family. And I also wanted to point out, Marie is one of the Library Reads Hall of Fame winners. I'm going to put the link in the chat box there for you. If you go to our website at libraryreads.org and check out the Hall of Fame, there's a link right to it on the front page. Marie has her very own page there. Hall of Fame winners are authors, I should say, where they've had 3 or more books appear on the Library Reads list. And Marie is a big time Library Reads fan favorite. So she is on our Hall of Fame. Go and check that out. Also, just check out our website to find out more about Library Reads. But Marie, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let's start talking about your book.
Well, before we do, can I just say a big shout out to libraries and librarians everywhere? Is that okay?
Awesome, yes.
I know we have all been through such a year. It's been such a tough year for everybody. And for many of us, it's been so isolated. And, those normal connections that we were very accustomed to making have really dissipated and been hard to maintain during this time period. But libraries and librarians have been such a lifesaver for so many of us. They pivoted unbelievably in these crazy times and created incredible platforms and programming for their patrons. And I've been fortunate enough to connect with readers through virtual programs like these. So I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. And I know there's a bunch of libraries and librarians and library book clubs out there today, like my Aunt Marilyn. Hi from Albany. So I just want to say thank you to all. And I also just have to give a shout out to Library Reads. For those of you who are not familiar with what Library Reads do, they are this incredible organization that really elicits important information from their librarians and their whole audiences to find out what the best new books are that are coming out. And it's such, for me, I always go to the library reads lists every month to check out and see what they have going on. So I'm sorry I had to do that. I feel so happy that I'm here and indebted to libraries everywhere.
I don't think you ever have to be sorry for saying nice things about libraries. I mean, really, right? Thank you for that.
I wrote a whole book about my love for libraries. Carnegie's Maid. So
yes,
I'm a library girl. Yeah.
I think that was also probably the first book that you and I we had to talk about. So yeah.
That's right.
All right. Well, let's talk about this one. Let's do
it.
All right. So our first question for you. So your books, of course, we all know they are stories of women from history, most of the time that we don't know or haven't really heard their stories before. So tell us, to get us started, how do you find these women to write about, and what do you put in place before you write their stories?
Oh my gosh, such a good question. First of all, these women are hiding in plain sight. They're literally everywhere waiting for us to find them. Once, I was a New York City lawyer for way too long. And when I finally kind of made that decision to write, to really unearth these hidden stories of historical women, I feel like I developed almost like an antenna for them. I know that sounds like kind of like a crazy, antiquated phrase for what it is, but that really is what it is. And I really read about them, hear about them, see them everywhere. So what does that actually mean though, right? I mean, are they marching into my room? No, but I'm on the lookout for them. So for example, with my first book in this series, The Other Einstein, which is about Albert Einstein's first wife, who was a physicist herself. I'd never heard of her. I'm not a huge Einstein fan, although there are many of those out there. I happened to be reading a children's biography with one of my sons, who's a science kid, years ago when he was younger. And there were 2 sentences about this woman who was a physicist herself in university with Albert Einstein. And I just, that antenna started to go crazy. And I started to think, how have I never heard about the fact that Albert Einstein went to school with and then married a physicist, right? So that's kind of like one example of how I find them. I've had readers mention famous, incredible women to me. I've read articles in research, I find them. In the case of Agatha Christie, who of course is our heroine in The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, it was a little bit different. And I know we're going to talk about that in a second, about how the fact that she's famous actually makes her quite different from most of the women I read about, who are generally speaking unknown. In this case, of course, I always knew who she was. I was, in fact, an Agatha Christie freak. I loved her books since middle school. But when I actually kind of went down the rabbit hole of research around Agatha, the person, not Agatha, the writer and icon, I learned so much about who she was, how she came to be the incredible writer who left this amazing legacy. And that's also something I'm always interested in, kind of the origin stories of these women. And once I learned that at the heart of her life was a real life disappearance, well, then I knew I had to tell her. She was next on the list for sure.
Very cool. So as you touched upon, she's obviously not one of those unknown women from history, right? Like, she's someone we do know, quite the contrary.
Oh, yeah.
But she does have this real life mystery. And so how did you decide, what made you go from talking about these sort of unknown women behind the scenes to choosing someone who was so famous? So why did you decide that her story was the next one you wanted to tell? And tell us a little bit about your research. We're going to get into that. I know that's what everybody, librarians love to know, the background. So tell us a little bit about that.
Gosh, well, as you said, I almost didn't write this book because she's famous. And in fact, Agatha Christie and the story of her disappearance had been on this really long list of stories and women that I want to tell for a long, long time, for many years. And I kind of skipped over it, going back towards some of these lesser known women. Agatha's legacy is almost unimaginably huge. She has sold more than 2 billion books. I mean, as a writer, like 2 billion books. That's like so hard to get your head around.
A little amazing.
It's amazing. I mean, she has, she's the most successful novelist of all time. She really created, in many ways, the golden age of mystery genre and a lot of its tenets. She's so masterful. But the disappearance itself, it was really torn from the pages of one of her own novels. And as I got into her life and really learned about how she sort of rose up and claimed this legacy, and the way in which that disappearance was really pivotal in her decision to really raise up and really buck the norms of her society to become a writer, this story of her disappearance became really compelling. And it also fit this criteria I really have for the women I'm interested in. Not only there's lots of wonderful historical women out there who have led unbelievable lives, but the ones I'm interested in are women who left a really important legacy behind, one that we benefit from every day ourselves, but we may not know who that woman is. Now, of course, in Agatha Christie's case, we know who she is, right? But I also want to write about women who are struggling with very present day issues. We think of historic women as being so very different from ourselves, but in fact, they really struggle with a lot of the same things that modern day women do. Oh. And the more I looked at Agatha's story, I could see that she was struggling with issues that are very common to modern day women. The work-life balance, right? How to really struggle with ambition when you have all these other responsibilities. And those issues are very, very much issues that modern day women deal with as well. So that's kind of how I kind of overcame that hurdle of writing about a famous person.
Very cool. Very cool. So as I mentioned in your intro, you're a bit of an archaeologist. And I guess we should also say a bit of a detective too, right? Because I'm sure that you are, you kind of start out with this kind of clue about what you'd like to write about, but then you have to put pieces of your puzzle together. So especially I think for this book, there's definitely this mystery element to it. So I don't think it's any spoilers here to say, this, because it really did happen. Agatha Christie disappeared. So it's something, though, that was not ever really talked about much. She never really addressed it. It was not something that she wanted to define her life by. So is there a lot of information out there about her disappearance? And if not, how did you kind of fit the pieces together? Tell us a little bit about your investigative process. Sure. to come up with the book.
To check it out. In some ways, the way in which I researched and approached this book was the similar process that I use for all my stories, right? So it does diverge, and I'll tell you about that in a second.
Cool.
In terms of really piecing together Agatha's life, I don't write stories from like birth to death, but I usually take a specific pivotal point in time or it's decade in a woman's life. And when I'm doing that kind of research, I'm always looking for original source material, letters, journals, things written in the woman's own hand during that time period, or things written by contemporaries. And when I can't find that, I will go larger and kind of look a lot about the sort of broader historical context, social, political, cultural, and I'll look at the sort of micro details of their world too, what they're eating, what they're dressed like, things like that to really create that very authentic world. And that I definitely did for the part of the story that really traces the evolution of Agatha Christie from a young woman into the days of her disappearance. The most important piece of research for that sort of group of that portion of the story was Agatha's own autobiography. For those of you who don't know, and for those of you who like Agatha Christie, you should really read it. She wrote when she was much older, in her 70s, she wrote an autobiography of her life. And it's fabulous. It's this rambling look at this idyllic childhood. But about her disappearance, she says absolutely nothing. There is no mention of her disappearance. And I actually kind of looked at that as an invitation for me to kind of step in and
I love it.
Figure out what happened. And then once I went down that rabbit hole of the disappearance itself, as you mentioned, she never spoke of it. She didn't write about it in her autobiography. She never raised it in an interview. She didn't talk about it with her family. And the police basically accepted the excuse that she gave when they found her, which was that she had amnesia. So there's literally nothing from her perspective about what happened during that time. So for the portion of the story that dealt with her disappearance, as you know, I told it from the perspective of the husband. And really what I wanted to kind of capture was that day by day experience of her disappearance, the hunt for her, which was the largest in England's history. And for that, there was tons of material because there are a bazillion newspaper articles. It was one of the most covered events in history from that time period. All over the world, people really tracked her disappearance, the search for her, the false leads, the red herrings, and there was tons of material for that. So, what was missing, was what I supplied in the book, which was Agatha's perspective of what happened.
Love it. That is really super cool. I think that it's almost like thinking, she was watching over your shoulder to make you tell her story because she didn't want to tell it, and now it's removed enough. And she's like, here, I'll let a pro like Marie Benedict tell my story.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I think that's how it went. Right?
Well, you know what? In some ways, what I do now is like what I did when I was a lawyer, right? I sift through the facts to create a narrative on behalf of a client, and the client are these historical women, and I'm advocating for them, right? And
I love it.
That's kind of what I do. It's, I'm archaeologist / recovering attorney. Let's put it that way.
I can't leave it behind.
I hope that Agatha would approve of sort of my perspective of what happened.
That is awesome. I love it. I love it. So the mystery of Mrs. Christie is told in dual timelines. You have the manuscript and then what we'll call the investigation. So why did you decide that the story needed to be written this way? And what were your challenges? Or, did you have any challenges kind of writing dual timeline? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of all goes back to one of Agatha's own books, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, I hope you read it. It is like the quintessential unreliable narrator story. And if you're not familiar with an unreliable narrator, it's a story in which at least one of the characters who's narrating the tale is not telling the truth. They're either not telling the full story or they're actively telling lies, right?
My favorite kind of story, frankly.
Oh, I love it.
Right?
I know. And this book is considered probably the best of its kind. She was absolutely incredible. And what's amazing is that she actually wrote this book. That was the book that came out right before she disappeared. So this whole notion of creating, telling a false story, whether through omission or through lies, was very at the very forefront of her mind, I think. And once a part of the research I did was to reread her books, not every single one of them, but I really focused in on the ones that she wrote before her disappearance, right after her disappearance. And this book, after I finished reading it, I just couldn't help but think a woman who was this masterful in the art of plotting and this unbelievably crafty at creating masks behind which her characters hide, she could not have just been a victim in her own vanishing. It's not possible. And so I kind of took that idea and that whole idea of the unreliable narrator, it became the lens through which I looked at her disappearance. It became, sort of the lens through which I evaluated her life history, the way I kind of looked at the days leading up to her disappearance and then the actual 11 days where she was missing. And so really in telling the story and in talking about the way she might have approached it, I really very much had those elements in play. And as I evaluated it that way, it seemed to me the best way to pay homage to that and to maybe her mindset at that time was to write in some way. I don't want to give away too much if people haven't read it, but an unreliable narrator story, because that's what it is. I mean, in many ways, it is an unreliable narrator story. It resolves at the end and you do find out what's true and what's not to some extent. But there are omissions and there are mistruths. And the other thing about that and about that theme that was really compelling to me is that I think I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in modern day themes with these historic women. And I think that the idea of an unreliable narrator is a really modern theme. We are all of us unreliable narrators of our lives, especially in the era of social media. We are constantly curating our existence and presenting it to the world in a particular way. And, that's a very modern day conundrum, but it's also one I think Agatha obviously played with it with her books, but I think she played with it during her disappearance as well.
Fascinating. Oh, what an interesting parallel. I think you are right. And then now we have to think about what would she have done in the age of social media?
She would have had a field day.
I mean,
or if she was the person she became on the other side of this disappearance, because I looked at that as well. She changed very much. She was a very different person on the other side of this. And I think she wouldn't have, if she were that person, she wouldn't have even been on social media.
Fascinating. Very interesting.
Yeah.
All
She's
right.
an incredible person.
So, now you, of course, as we've mentioned your previous titles, all of these wonderful women. So which of the women in your books? So we have Mileva Marish, Einstein's first wife, Clara Kelly, Andrew Carnegie's maid, Hedy Lamarr, the brilliant scientist and Hollywood bombshell, Clementine Churchill, Winston Churchill's wife, and now Agatha Christie. So with all of these fascinating women that you have covered, who do you identify with the most? And which parts of you are in some of these women? Tell us a little bit about that. We're always fascinated to, did you relate? Who do you relate to? If all of them, then tell us.
Well, first of all, I have to say thank you for asking the question that way. People always ask me, who's your favorite? And it's like saying, which of your children is your favorite? Because as I'm writing these stories, I feel so close to these women. And I really think of myself as their advocates, like I said earlier. And so for me, I don't have a favorite. I do, though, as you so smartly pointed out, I do identify with them in very particular ways. It kind of goes back a little bit to what I said about Agatha. So when I was trying to figure out who she was, I reread her books because all of us writers, whether we do it intentionally or not, we leave little bits and pieces of ourselves behind in those books. And I'm definitely no exception, for sure. There are definitely little bits and pieces of me in each of the women that I write about. And that's probably why I'm attracted to their particular stories, so for example, in The Other Einstein, the story, which is about Albert Einstein's first wife, Mileva Marish, and The Only Woman in the Room, which is about Hedy Lamarr, the famous film bombshell, but also incredible scientist. I found one of the things I found so compelling about both of their stories is that they were, to use the title, they were the only women in the room. They were women in a very, very male dominated world. And when I'm talking about Hedy, I'm not talking about the film world, although that was male dominated also. I was more interested in her as a Jewish refugee and an actress and an inventor than I was as an actress. But those two women, and then Clementine Churchill, who was really Winston Churchill's political partner. Those three women so often found themselves to be the only female in a room full of men, a sea of men. And that is something that I could really identify with from my years as a lawyer. When I went into the legal profession in the 90s, I won't say when and date myself, but a while ago, there weren't women in the numbers that there are today. I went to a humongous New York City law firm. I can't even tell you how frequently I was the only woman in a conference room, the only woman in a meeting, the only woman with the clients. And I could really relate to how those women felt in those situations. And I really drew upon those personal experiences. Other women have other things, with Agatha Christie, certainly the desire to be a writer, is something I can identify with, and overcoming sort of societal barriers to do that. I mean, the barriers that I had to overcome were very different than Agatha's. In Agatha's time, there was a real barrier to women working, women writing, women doing anything outside the home. Obviously, I didn't have that, but there was a lot of societal reinforcement in staying as an attorney because it was a really approved profession for a woman. And so overcoming sort of society's expectations to rise up and claim my own legacy is something that I really identified with Agatha Christie. Now, Clara Kelly in Carnegie's Maid, certainly I love, that's really my homage to the creation of the free library system. I've always been a major library freak since I was a kid. But really what I identify most with in that book is it's really the story of my own family's heritage. Irish immigrants who came to this country with bright but no education, who really had to take whatever work they could access, and sort of rose up and claimed opportunities that they had before them. And really, that's what my own ancestors did in order to sort of rise up and start the generational process of becoming educated, first high school and then college and beyond. So that's really, I identify with that book in that it's really steeped in my own family's history. So there's little bits and pieces of me sprinkled throughout all of those books.
I will say, I think, and I bet all of our readers would agree with me on this, that's probably what makes your book so special, is that you really do kind of put a little bit of yourself into them, or, you dig up something inside of you that it comes through in those books. So thank you for that. I think
that's like the biggest compliment.
I mean, it's
ever.
true. It's true. Really, and I meant to say that after you were telling us also how, you really look for like the little special details of what people wore and how they might have spoken or what maybe they ate. As readers, especially astute readers, like library folks,
right?
We those things pop out to us. So you definitely, it's important to have those details, and I think that's truly what makes your book so good. So that's really awesome.
My year, Rebecca. Thank you.
No, thank you for kind of sharing an inside look at that. I think we're all interested in.
I have to say that I come by it honestly, like. As a kid, I wanted to be a time traveler. This is the closest I'm ever going to get, going into this sort of deep dive into these historic worlds and really digging out these women and the worlds that they inhabited. All those little details are the things that I love. If you didn't love going down the rabbit hole into what people wore in the 1850s, then you probably shouldn't write a story.
Right? I mean, and anybody can sort of like gather a bunch of random facts and put it on a page, but it really takes somebody who is truly interested and invested in this to make it lively and interesting. So kudos to you for that. So, all right, let's go. I'm looking at the time here. Let's move into our trivia portion.
Time to win.
Time to win. Okay. So we are going to test your knowledge of classic Agatha Christie novels by giving you some clues and ask you to guess which book the clue refers to. So for Facebook Live participants, the trivia questions are going to show up in the comments for you to answer. For those of you on Zoom, we're going to have the questions pop up in just a moment here on the screen. And remember that every time you participate, we're going to enter you into the drawing for the mystery book bundle. So, you'll have to pardon me this evening. I don't have my mouse set up, so I'm like trying to do this on my screen. I'm looking at all of these
great, Rebecca.
These great questions coming in too. So it might take me a little longer than usual to pick some of those out, but don't worry, we're going to get to as many as we can. But let's have the trivia start up. So there we go. Here's our first one. This book's protagonist convicted of poisoning her husband. I'm going to let you guys go ahead and read these questions yourselves and put in your answers, because I want to ask Marie while you're doing this. Marie, tell us what you're reading. What are some of the things that you like to read? Everybody always likes to know that. So
absolutely. Well, if it's okay, I kind of grouped different books that I'm reading by category.
Awesome.
And I thought I'd share them with each of your three questions.
It's almost like you should work in a library.
Imagine maybe in another life. Okay, so for my first category, I am going to tell you what I'm reading in mystery right now.
Awesome.
And I have to say, during the pandemic, it wasn't that I read like 3 books. I read like a bazillion books in each of these categories. Of course, I read many more Agatha Christie novels, including like her only spy thriller, which I really got a kick out of, N or M. But what I discovered that was new, I read every single one of the Louise Penny Inspector Gamache series.
Yeah.
If you have not read those books, I highly recommend them. They're not only great puzzles, terrific stories, the sense of place, the setting. While during the pandemic, it was almost like I was traveling to this idyllic town in Canada, Three Pines, which I loved. And the other books that I loved, and then we'll get to the answer, is Lucy Foley. I don't know if anybody's read those, The Guest List.
Yes, The Guest List.
They were great. They were almost like modern day Agatha Christie novels, you know, an isolated setting, really fun reads from that perspective. So those are kind of my mystery recommendations.
All right. Did everybody see
a lot of love for
Louise Penny? She's a favorite. So I think all three of the questions, have they come up yet? I know I saw the second one about the serial killer on the loose.
Should I go to my next list?
Go to your next bundle of books.
I can't see that. Okay. I thought I'd tell you what I've read in historical fiction, because I have been fortunate to read a lot of advanced books to give quotes. So I'm going to list some books maybe that aren't even out yet, but people might want to read. Kate Quinn's The Rose Code. Fantastic. I love that. And Kate and I actually wrote a short story together recently. Patty Callahan's Surviving Savannah. Greer McAllister's Arctic Fury. Lauren Willig's Band of Sisters, this incredible story about these World War I Smith graduates who went off to war. Sadika Johnson's Yellow Wife was fabulous. Susan Meisner's The Nature of Fragile Things. I would tell you more about them, but I know we don't have time. Chanel Cleaton's The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. Kristen Harmel's The Forest of Vanishing Stars. That doesn't come out till July, but reserve it now. It's good. Erica Roebuck's The Invisible Woman. Jillian Cantor's Half-Life was about Marie Curie. It was excellent. Pam Jenoff's The Woman with the Blue Star comes out next week, I think. Again, put that on hold. And Natalie Lester's Riviera House comes out this summer. All excellent, excellent historical fiction reads.
Cool. Who is with me here that thinks that Marie should be an honorary Reader's Advisory Librarian?
Oh, baby.
I think that she's got it down. She's got.
I love it. I'm a crazy reader too. I have a problem.
All right, and then let's see. We had the last trivia question, which was about 10 strangers invited to an island. So I think. And now everybody should be able to see. We've got the trivia answers are popping up on screen now. How did you all do? Everybody get there. All right. Marie, did you let us know all your books? Did you have any other books?
Oh, no, I'm not done yet.
All right.
Should I give you my last group?
Yes.
And these are just books I read recently when I went away. So I just read them for myself, no categories. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I don't know if anybody read that.
Good one.
Good. Such a good one. So different, so unusual. Lauren Wilkinson's American Spy, a most unusual spy novel. Excellent. Really good. I'm sure many of you have read Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, which was really good. And Anne Enright's Actress. Those are ones that I read just for me.
Just for you. You know, sometimes those are the best ones.
Yeah. Well, everything I read that I listed today was excellent.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing those with us. And thank you everyone for playing along with the trivia. Hopefully you all got those done well. If you missed any of Marie's books, I did see they are floating through the chat there. So make sure that and they've helpfully linked those as well. So make sure you check those all out. And now let's get to some audience questions. All right. I'm going to do my best. As of right now, I have 54 questions in the queue.
Oh,
I don't think we're going to get to them all. So sorry. But this is great. I wanted to take a quick moment too and thank everyone, because one of the most fun things about these interviews is getting those audience questions. And I love everyone that that asks the questions. You all come up with such thoughtful, really cool questions, and the authors appreciate them. I appreciate them. So let's get into some. All right. This one is a juicy one. So I'm going to ask this one first. Francie Clark asks, was Agatha Christie's husband as awful as portrayed in your book? He seems over the top awful. Tell us more about that. Did you make all that up, or was he really a bad dude?
Well, it's Francie or Francine. I'm not sure. Thank you for the question. I very much appreciate it. I wish I could say I made all that up. I really do, because Agatha was a wonderful, complicated, sometimes over the top woman in her younger years. But a lot of there's a certain piece of it, which I could say maybe without revealing too much, that there are some exaggerations in the things that he did. It's part of the story. It's part of the unreliable narrator piece, without giving away too much for those who haven't read it. That said, a lot of the things are part of the record. We don't know for sure. We weren't there. And Archie has never spoken about his time with Agatha ever. And in her autobiography, she skimmed right over her years with Archie just as quickly as she skimmed over her own disappearance. But we do know that he, and pardon me if this is a spoiler for those who haven't read it, he did have an affair. He was having an affair in the months, if not year, leading up to her disappearance. He tried to leave her when she was in deep mourning over her mother because of this affair. So there was a certain amount of callousness that I tried to capture in the book, which is allegedly true. Of course, I write fiction, so the details, the particulars, those are all fiction. What I tried to do, because a lot of the things I found were disturbing, and I really felt for Agatha that she went through a lot of that. I tried to humanize him to some extent, to try to get a handle on why some of these things might have happened to him, why he was the way he was, without excusing it, but to kind of get in his head a little bit. And I really, I don't want to say fixated, but I really came to believe that he had PTSD. He was a pilot during World War I, and the conditions that the pilots were in during these very early years of flying, they were terrible. So many men died. He had all sorts of altitude issues. And he was lucky to survive, to be honest. And he was different when he came back. She's reported as having said that. So I do think there might be a certain element of that. That's not to excuse the things that he did, but it is to help kind of put them in context, and why Agatha was really thrown for a loop, that the person that she married really was not the person who arrived home after the war.
That's a fascinating perspective on that. Very interesting. I have a similar question asked by Bonnie, and then Bonnie and Dina ask a similar question. Bonnie was asking if this was fact-based, their relationship, and really, how did you kind of ferret out the story of their marriage, and also her relationships with the rest of her family, her mother and her sister? And Dina kind of piggybacks on that question, asking if it was difficult to find some source material for this. So could you speak just for a moment on, some of the sources that you found to get some of these details?
Absolutely. So, some of the stuff in terms of her relationships, especially her familial relationships, those are really well described in the autobiography. Okay. Now, again, Agatha's a little bit of her own unreliable narrator. She picks and chooses what she likes to share, but she does go into a lot very sort of two-sided pieces of information about her family. She was unusually close with her mother. Everyone reports that, and that she definitely captures her, relationships with her brother and her sister Madge, which were Madge in particular, very important to her. Those are really all captured there. And I definitely took what she said in the autobiography with a grain of salt because of the unreliable nature of it. You can tell from the way she writes, and in fact, the way she reads it, there are actually audio recordings of her reading her autobiography aloud, which is priceless. Yeah. You can really see it and feel it. The stuff with Archie is harder. She talks only a little bit about him in in her autobiography.
That's very telling, isn't it?
However, the family has a lot of letters that she had written to them, that she had that she had written during that time period, sort of back and forth. They're not publicly available, but some of her biographers were granted access to those letters as they were doing their own biography. So I used a lot of excerpts from those letters, recaps of interviews, and there are some wonderful writings that her grandson has actually done about Agatha. Agatha he knew, and he collected pictures and letters from different time periods in her life. And so those you can actually see yourself. They're very closed. The family is very closed in terms of what they're willing to share. But all of those things kind of came together to give as good a picture, I feel like, as I could with her family and with Archie. A lot of the scenes with Archie, we don't know the details. Like we do know the day, the actual date and the sort of circumstances of their meeting. But we don't know what they said to each other on the dance floor. We don't know what it was about him that really swept her off her feet. So I think that's kind of a good example of where the fiction comes in as compared to the fact. We know that they met at the Chudley Ball, the Chudley Ball on a particular day. We know he took a ticket that her family friend couldn't use. He was looking for her. We know that they danced multiple times, but we don't know what they said to each other. And it was that sort of thing that I filled in with fiction. And it had to be good, right? Because that was it for her after that. So, but that was the case a lot. You know, we knew that they met on certain dates, but we don't know all the details of what happened.
Very cool. Very cool.
I hope that answers that.
It does. And then I have another question that actually just came up from Lakita that I want to, because it piggybacks on here. Yeah. How, as a writer, what's your starting point for creating dialogue when you don't have historical records or letters? You know, you just told us you had to sort of make up what their conversation might have been like. Where does it just pop into your head? Give us some, how do you
well, so, you know, I would say the dialogue in particular, I really only start to write those parts of scenes when I feel like I have fully immersed myself in the woman, her life. And I feel like I've got a sense of her voice, like almost like I can hear in my own head. Now, with the case of Agatha Christie again, listening to her narrate her own autobiography. I mean, I could hear her in my head, the way she spoke, the cadence of her speech, the kinds of language. And I research, you know, the vernacular of different time periods, slang words they might have used, the way they would have phrased something. So I'll do like some sort of linguistic research as well to make sure that I capture it. But once I get a sense of that, my character's voice in my head, that's when I can start to write the dialogue and kind of fit it into the scenes that I know are going to happen. You know, kind of once I've crafted the scene, the voice kind of will fit in there.
Very cool. Very cool.
That makes sense.
All right. I have a question here from Donna, who says, Marie, you did so much research for this book. What were you unable to find in your research that you're still dying to know? What question would you ask Agatha Christie if you had that opportunity?
Oh my goodness.
That's a good one.
I would ask Agatha Christie, what really happened? Did I get it right? I don't know.
Did I get it right?
We literally have no idea. I mean, that's both the blessing and the curse of writing this particular book, right? Is that we really don't know what happened, right? So over the years, the decades, there have been multiple suppositions and theories about what happened to her, why it happened. Was it her fault? Was it his fault? Was it somebody else's? What did she do? So the blessing of that is that, you know, I write fiction. And so I can create kind of what I think might have happened based on not some willy-nilly idea, but based on a deep look at the woman's life, where she was at the time, mentally, socially, psychologically at the time it happened, and where she was on the other side. And because I'm so interested in those themes of how a woman or these women rose up and really bucked the traditions and expectations of their time period to do something unusual, such that it lived on in our lives, such that we are, benefit from it. I'm pursuing those themes as I kind of fill in those blanks. But if I were to ask her any question, it would be, did I get it right?
I get it right.
I don't know. That's a great question. I've thought about it a lot. That is what I would ask her.
Very cool. All right. I have a comment here and then a question from Jill. Jill wanted to let you know that her granddaughter, who is 23, visited last week, and they laughed when they found out that they're both reading, she and her granddaughter are both reading The Only Woman in the Room at the time. So she wants to let you know that she appreciates that you appeal to different generations, obviously. And she'd like to know, what training have you had as a writer? So we know, you've got this great university background and you're a lawyer. So
right.
tell us a little bit about becoming a writer and what your process was to make that happen.
To become a writer. I read books. That's about it.
There you go.
I mean, there are definitely days when I wish, I had an MFA in creative writing, or I had extensive training in how to write a book and construct different things. But really, I really do. As you can see from some of my lists, I'm a crazy, voracious reader, and I have been that way my entire life since I was a precocious reader, and I'm a voracious reader. And I really think that being a reader is what makes you a writer, because once you read enough books, you can almost hear the story unfold right before you. And that's not to say I wouldn't benefit from a little bit of extra training, but I do think it is, having been a lifelong avid reader is what makes me a writer. And I know when I'm doing, I read a tremendous amount for pleasure, obviously, but I read so much all the time for my work. I'm reading research books, I'm reading novels, for Agatha Christie, I read tons of mystery novels, but I'm always a better writer when I'm reading an incredible work of fiction. Most likely not in my own genre, because I try not to read in my genre when I'm writing.
That's another one of our questions for you. So you just, everybody always wants to know that.
I can't. I mean, I do read in my genre, obviously, but not when I'm writing. I can't do that. I have to keep it clear, my mind clear of the way someone else might approach the past. That said, I can read, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and I'm going to be all right writing historical fiction. But when I'm reading a really beautifully written book, my own writing is better.
There you go. That's
my only tip. It's not a very specific one, but
no, I think that's very interesting. So we have, let's see here. Got a bunch, a lot of people asking sort of the same thing, wanting to know. This is, and you can give us as much of a spoiler or not, but I have several people, can't name them all off because it's a lot of you guys, want to know, who are you interested in writing about next? It doesn't necessarily have to be your next book coming out, but who's on your short list of women, other kind of unsung women that you would like to cover?
Oh my gosh, there are so many. I mean,
so many.
I have a laundry list. I will say this. I think I'm allowed to say this because I think it's known. I don't like to talk about books that I'm, maybe writing, projected to write. But the book I'm writing that comes out next January, which I just finished, is called Her Hidden Genius. Okay. And it's the story of Rosalind Franklin. Now, this is a woman who truly isn't known. And a lot of the stories about the fact that she isn't known and should be known. She was a brilliant, unorthodox, passionate British scientist in the 1940s and 50s. Her family was Jewish. They saved many, many refugees during World War II. They were an affluent Jewish British family. And she really went against societal expectations to become a physicist and a chemist. And she developed, was one of the early developers of this technique called X-ray crystallography, which allowed her to see incredibly minute substances. And through years of labor, she actually discovered the double helix structure and therefore the function of DNA. She had these incredible images, tons and tons of data. Without her knowledge and without her permission, one of her colleagues took that data. This was a colleague who was very, very jealous of her work, and a male colleague, and shared it with two gentlemen you might know better at a different university, James Watson and Francis Crick. In a span of 6 weeks, it took her years to put together all this information. They took that data and they wrote a paper that they published, and they won the Nobel Prize for it. And they are, very well known, Watson and Crick, for the discovery of the double helix nature of DNA, which basically unlocked genetics and has had ramifications, the likes of which we can't even get our heads around. And it's her story. It's so much more than, it's not even really a sad story in many ways, even though it's very frustrating. But it's also the story of how a woman, she has started to be known in more recent times. She's become something of a feminist icon. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me is how she went from purposely being forced into the shadows by her coworkers, and then shoved into those corners when James Watson wrote a biography about her, painting her as a horrific shrew who didn't know what she was doing, I think to kind of hide the fact that he had actually stolen all of her data. And the reaction to that biography is what launched her name. I don't want to say widely because she's still not super well known, but launched sort of a movement to get her credit for what she'd done, because people were horrified at the description. So it's really a deep look at one of our most important scientists, for sure. But it's also a look at something, as I always said, something very modern, the way in which women, especially in the sciences, are marginalized and their contributions suppressed. And she's probably the most blatant example that I've ever come across. So that is out there.
Super cool.
It's an incredible story. She was absolutely incredible.
That is very cool. I've heard her name before. So I'm going to look forward to reading that one. Very cool.
Good. I hope you like it. I mean, it's at first, honestly, I wasn't sure that I wanted to write it because, as you know, I'm not a scientist, and I've written all these books about scientists, but her journey is so fascinating. And even the forgiveness that she shows, it's really a beautiful story. And horrible.
Very cool. All right, we have a time for a couple quick more questions here. Like I said, I'm scrolling through all these weirdly on my laptop. And we have a couple of folks who have asked sort of a similar question. So I'm going to ask the one, which is, did you have to get permission from any of Christie's relatives to write anything? And sort of piggyback to that, a couple people that have asked, have you spoken to anyone or interviewed anyone from her family or her estate, or were there any details like that you can share?
So that's a question a lot of people are curious about. And that's true for whoever I write about, the Churchills, Hedy Lamarr, you name it. I don't reach out to the families.
Okay.
And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, I write fiction. I don't write nonfiction. If I were to be writing a biography, I absolutely would have to reach out to the families. Very often the family doesn't have any firsthand information, right? Most of the women I'm writing about have been gone for a long time, and they may have letters, things like that, but for the most part, they themselves don't have firsthand information. They didn't experience.
That's a good point. Mm-hmm.
The person during that time period. Secondly, it can be tricky to involve a family in your fictional depiction of their family member. They may or may not like the way you have fictionally depicted the person.
That is a good point.
Presented the situation. Now, I would certainly hope that a family would, if they were to read one of the books that I've written, they would see it for what it is, which is that these women are my heroines and that I'm trying to honor them through these books.
Yeah.
I try to be very respectful of the women. I try to, I mean, they're not perfect. None of the women are perfect. They all have flaws because they're human beings and we all have flaws. And sometimes it's those very flaws that give rise to the legacy, right? Sometimes it's, in the case of, Clementine Churchill, her feistiness and her really lack of desire to be a mother, which is what led her to become an incredible political partner, right? She wasn't happy to stay at home and care for her children, which is what most women of her time were doing.
Yeah.
So that would have been perceived as a flaw during her time period, but without that, she wouldn't have been who she became. And that's very often the case because these women are going outside the norm, going outside the traditional, conventional path. That said, I have heard back from several people, from several families about
Tell us about that.
And that has been like the most rewarding experience because while I don't involve them in the process because I don't know that I wouldn't end up with the book that I want to write. It just warms my heart that they see the books for what they are. So for example, I received a lovely note from one of Clementine Churchill's granddaughters, her oldest daughter's granddaughter. So it would have been her great-granddaughter, sorry, saying that she had read the book and how much she appreciated the depiction of Clementine. And that was like, that was better than any praise I could have gotten, really. And the same is true for Hedy Lamarr. I heard, I didn't receive a note, but I heard through someone that we both know, a mutual acquaintance, that her son appreciated the depiction of his mother. So that kind of feedback, lets me feel like I'm on the right track, and that even though they may not love all the details that are coming out, certainly nothing that I've written that would be really out there doesn't have any, it's not like it's without any basis in the factual record. But I do want them to know that I honor and respect their mothers or sisters or, ancestors. Yeah. And the feedback I have gotten has been really, really positive.
Oh, that's awesome. Very good. Well, and I think, like you said, these are real women that, you have to be respectful of. And I think you do a great job of it. So that's really cool to hear that the families, yeah.
But that said, they're not really, they're my fictional version.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is what that woman did. I'm saying in my fictional universe, this is how I think this could have unfolded, and sort of in keeping with the themes that I'm interested in, the sort of stories I want to tell.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. To wrap up the questions, I am sorry we could not get to all 66 of them. I have one that a couple people have asked in different ways, so I'll phrase it this way. We have people wondering, has there been someone that you wanted to write about but didn't get the chance to because someone beat you to it, or because maybe you couldn't find enough information on them? Is that a thing or not?
Oh gosh. Well, I have to say, I have like well over 100 women on my list. So,
that is so awesome.
Often I can't say those are all my women, right? Yeah. I can't be, all of them. But there's always so many women. I'm glad when I see someone else having written about one of these women, because I'm not going to get to all 100.
Take it off the list.
Right? I feel like, and sometimes I feel like if I don't write the book, nobody is going to, because maybe nobody would find it fascinating enough.
That's great.
Like recently I saw Stephanie Dre's writing a book about Frances Perkins, and I think she was the Secretary of Labor under FDR, one of the only women in a cabinet position. I've kind of had her on my list, and I saw Stephanie's writing a book about her, and I was like, yay, that's great. Like, there's always a little part of you that's like, oh, is she going to cover that? I hope she gets that. But I was really happy to see that more and more women, more and more writers are writing about more and more of these real women. And that is really gives me such joy. I'm sure there have been or will be some books that I wanted to write that someone beat me to it. But like I said, I have so many women whose stories deserve to be told. I can't get possessive about the women on my list.
That's awesome. What a great answer. All right. Well, I think we'll close with that one. Marie,
Thanks so
it
much.
was absolutely delightful to talk to you this evening. Thank
It was
you
a
so
delight
much.
to talk to you, and
Appreciate you spending your
delight
time
to
with
be
us.
here.
Yes, and thank you to our audience. This
Thank
was
you guys.
interaction for you guys. So we are going to momentarily, I don't think it went through yet, so we're going to list the book bundle winners in the
Ooh.
chat. Oh, there we go.
Oh,
They
I
just
see
came
one.
through. Check to see if you won a mystery book bundle. And if your name is listed, please email Emily. Her email is right there in the chat. So you can
Congratulations.
get your prize. And really, it's been a real pleasure. And really, thank you to all of our participants. This is one of my favorite days of the month when I get to do the Mystery Book Club. Good time. So make sure that you join us for the next one. It's going to be Wednesday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And I'll be talking with Sulari Gentle, the author of Shanghai Secrets. This book follows wealthy bohemian artist Rowan Sinclair as he seeks answers in a foreign city for the murder of a girl who claims she is the Princess Anastasia. Oh, Marie, that's somebody that should be on your list, probably. I bet she's on your list, isn't she?
Never tell.
So you don't want to miss that book or the event.
Fantastic.
The registration event has gone through up there in the chat, and there will be a copy of that chat available, I know. So go ahead and register for that one early. So thanks again to everybody for coming. Thank you so much for Marie. Such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for spending your time with us. We really appreciate that. I hope everyone has a happy and healthy evening.
Thank you all so much.